welcome to the first set of the videos where I start looking at the different types of joinery that can be used in our timber projects. If we're looking at the categories of timber joints, I've sort of broken them in three different key categories: widening joints, framing joints, and carcass joints. What you'll find is there's going to be a bit of crossover in some of the joints that can be used in multiple applications, but it's best to think of them in these three ways because of the specific structural applications of those different types of joints that are involved. In this particular video, I'm going to be showing you the widening joints. I'm going to show you a variety of joints within this category and their uses. You'll probably understand a little bit better about how they actually work and how they're different and how they're similar, but there's not too much to understand. It's more about knowing in this video. Should be a real quick recap for you. And then by the end of it, you should be able to go off and do the actual research where you start looking at positive and negatives and how to actually produce and the safety features of each of those different joining techniques. So here we go. Let's get into it. I've just moved across now into Google SketchUp, where I've got some preset joints set up for you. The first of the joints that I've got here is a butt joint. Now, if we're looking at these samples here, you can see down the end here where my mouse is, that would be the end grain. Okay, so if I was going to demonstrate that, all the videos work in the same way. The end grain is sitting there where that red face is. So the length of the board is running this way here. And so when we're talking about widening a board, we're trying to get one of these long boards and get that piece to actually be, or appear to be, wider. Now, a butt joint, very simple joint. You should be very familiar with it. But essentially, you get this board here, and you butt it up against that so that the two join together. Now, if you're using two boards of the same species, same thickness, then you really shouldn't have any issues there in terms of getting those to match. And if I was going to demonstrate that to you, I could just pull out my paint bucket, pull out my wood, and if I just show you here, we would get something like this, some grain in it, and then something like this and do the same thing. When you're finished the widening joint, you may see a small seam line if you're looking really closely. Now, obviously on the computer, it's obvious because I've got a black line there. But in a real world application, you've got a very small seam line. It's a very natural looking process of widening. So the idea is getting those boards together. A butt joint purely is relying on the strength of the glue. There is nothing reinforcing that. So just demonstrate that again. I'll separate these two components. You see there's literally nothing in there. It would literally just be the application of the glue that makes these two boards hold together. Now, the problem with that, if we're thinking when they're joined together, if we were to get someone to stand right there on that joint, so if this was holding a fair amount of weight, there'd really be nothing holding that together, okay? If you were supporting it with rails along the ends, like in a coffee table application or a stool application, you'll find the strength is increased because it's being reinforced by those rails. But this joint on its own, quite a weak joint. Move across into a biscuit joint. So the biscuit joint, very similar in its application. It's still a widening joint here, but the difference is there is a small amount of reinforcement. So what we've got here are these biscuits. So just click on them so you can see them. 1, 2, 3 biscuits. You evenly space them along your board. You cut those using a specific plate jointer or a biscuit jointer to cut some holes in the timber specifically to match the size of your biscuit joints. You insert the biscuit joints with a little bit of glue and glue along that whole face where you're widening. And again, at the end of the joint, when we get these two boards, we pull them together. You can't notice that the biscuits are there. The biscuits help to reinforce that strength. So if someone was to stand on it, there'd just be an extra element of strength in there. Now, biscuits is the example I've shown you on the screen. Dowels work in the exact same manner, where there's a small piece of timber reinforcing along the widened joint, in the same way that a domino joint works as well. Now, if we're thinking about our applications in the classroom, domino joint is probably one of the more emerging based techniques because of how quick and simple it is. It's a lot more accurate when you compare that to the processes of getting the dowels to work in a classroom workshop. So dominoes is there as well. When we're thinking about the difference between a biscuit and the domino, or the dowel and the biscuit, if I just grab these biscuits here and pull them out, you'll see that their length matches the length of the board, so it's running in the same direction as the board. If I was to compare that to the domino, the domino actually runs perpendicular to the face of the board, so the strength is just that little bit greater as well. Okay, biscuit joint, dowel joint, domino joint, they are all a reinforced butt joint. Moving across now to the rebate joint. Now, the rebate joint works based on the premise of the rebate itself, and the rebate is where you basically make this little notch in there that runs the full length, and therefore you create an overlap. So you notch a bit out of the top of one board, you notch a bit out of the bottom of another board, and then if we're going to see how these actually fit together, piece them together, they'll fit like that. Okay, and down there in the actual detail, you can see there's the overlapping. Now again, this is increasing strength when compared to a butt joint. Now, process of achieving a rebate joint like this would be either cutting it on a table saw, multiple passes to cut that rebate off. Very unlikely that people would do that. More commonly, this would be achieved on a router table, where you have a router mounted upside down in a table with a spinning cutting blade. You run the timber across it and it cuts that rebate out. Now, router tables are actually banned in school environments here, particularly where I live. So the alternate to that is you actually create a jig and use a trimmer router or a full plunge router, and rather than having the router mounted to a table, you basically secure your project to the table and run the router across that face. Adds a little bit of degree of safety because the blade's pointed downwards and the person operating the machine is actually holding the machines and their fingers are nowhere near the spinning blade in that application as well. So there is a bit of a safety consideration to think about in the use of a rebate. The other problem with the rebate here is that if you cut your notches slightly too deep, then your boards won't match up and you have a little bit of a misalignment of your joinery there. The fourth of the joints here that I'm going to show you is the tongue and groove joint. Now, the tongue and groove is actually a really common joint to be used in wood applications, not so common that it's used in furniture making applications. So you probably wouldn't have seen it too much in our workshops here at school. Where have I seen this though? I don't know about you, but I've got timber floorboards at home, and I definitely know that every single one of these boards is connected using the tongue and groove system. Now, the benefits of tongue and groove, firstly, I'll just show you how they join together. So I can get this piece here, and it literally slots into there. So you end up with this really nice looking joint. More strength than a rebate joint because they're reinforced top and bottom as opposed to just on the top. So more strength than a rebate joint. Obviously more challenging to produce because there's now effectively 3 cuts that need to be made. The other benefit of the tongue and groove is timber naturally expands and contracts. So if we're thinking about how timber naturally expands and contracts, you can have a piece of timber that pulls apart and comes together as it naturally adjusts to the environment that it's in. And even if it pulls apart just a small amount there, where you can see it might have pulled apart by 1 millimeter, the actual integrity of the joint is still there, so it's still quite strong. So if we're thinking about our strength of all of these joints so far, the tongue and groove is definitely one of those really strong joints, particularly for this widening application. Is it as strong as a domino joint, a dowel joint, or a biscuit joint? Now, it's difficult for me to say definitively. It really depends on the application. It would depend on how big the tongue and the groove is, and how much movement is available within those. But from my experience, because the dominoes and the dowels typically penetrate into the timber just a little bit further, you can see this tongue is really only about a 5 mil depth, whereas a domino quite often will go in 20 or 25 mil penetrating into the side of the timber. It therefore just has that extra degree of strength. So I typically say the domino is a little bit stronger here, but is it as technically challenging to produce? Absolutely not. Now, there are a couple of ways you can produce a tongue and groove joint. You can produce it by doing a couple passes with a router or router trimmer, the same way we did the rebate, just with a few extra passes. A few extra jigs need to be set up for that. The other way that you can do this, you can actually buy a specialized router cutting bit for edge treatments that will actually cut the tongue and the groove in one single pass when you put a board across a router table. But again, router tables are banned in schools where I am, and as a result of that, it's not something that you would be able to see with us here in the workshops. Now, tongue and groove is going to look very similar to the next joint that I take you across to, and that's called the groove and feather. Here we are, groove and feather. You're probably looking and saying, no, it's nothing the same, but it really is. The green and the blue boards here are effectively identical. I've just changed the colors so that you can see that there are actually 3 parts to this joint. The groove pieces are identical. They have a little groove cut out in the same way that we did with the tongue and groove joint. The only difference here is the tongue is no longer connected to a piece. The tongue is independent. We actually then, because it's separated, call this a feather. So when we're thinking about how this joins together, a feather effectively sits in like that. Now the feather, if we're being real, which I suppose I should be, would actually extend the whole width, of that joint. So I'm not having great success in doing this on the live video. I think my graphics card is struggling a little bit as it tries to record. Okay. But you see the feather in this application actually extends the full width of the joint, and because of that, it actually is still quite strong. The benefit of this is you can make the feather as big as you want. The bigger, the stronger. So in this sense, it could potentially be stronger than a domino joint. The benefit of this real application, if we're thinking about some of the aesthetic features, if I just go and start to color these. So I'm just going to start coloring these so you can see the difference in how they would actually look. The main benefit that I see in using the tongue and feather is that you can actually use the feather as a feature for your project. So if you're working with a light board like pine, you can actually increase the aesthetic quality by using a darker colored feature timber as the feather to really highlight that you have created a custom joint that is super strong, and you've done it intentionally because you've decided to highlight that as a feature. Now, it's not always that you'd use contrasting colors to highlight things like this. Typically, you try and hide your joinery, such as dominoes, dowels, biscuits, etc. But when it comes to the groove and feather, one of the benefits is that you can actually exemplify and highlight the creation of that joint. So there you have it. We've ticked off the widening joints. I've shown you a variety of different joints. You should now have enough information to head off and complete your research on that part of your folio. Thanks very much, and I look forward to seeing you in our next video where we'll be going through the framing joints that are used in the timber workshops. Thanks very much, and I'll see you then.